What are you doing? You know where they are right now? Do you have any idea where they are right now?
Videos showing torn down flyers of Israeli hostages have gone viral. Matt Welch, who is part of the Fifth Column podcast and editor-at-large of Reason, joins me to discuss. We also talk about freedom of speech and what's happening on college campuses.
It's a free country.
A couple days ago, you posted a picture near your Brooklyn home of a partially torn down poster of a kidnapped Israeli by Hamas. What was your reaction to that? Can you walk us through that story?
Yeah, I was just walking with my kid, actually, to her, tech after school class thing. And this is right outside of, on the sidewalk out next to a Jewish elementary school that's just really literally across the street from me. And so I expected to see on the trees and on the poles and things these kidnapped flyers that we've seen in a lot of different places. What I didn't expect was to see kind of the corner carcasses of them being ripped down. That was in itself kind of just a surprise and a gut punch. This isn't a particularly progressive activist neighborhood. This is a old school Italian neighborhood that's gentrifying rapidly, and the old Italian grandmothers are going to sell out their brownstone and move to Staten Island or New Jersey, but it's not a big hotbed of progressive activism like Park Slope, which is not that far away. So kind of surprised to see that. And then what kind of hit me even harder was that they clearly had moved up the flyers up the tree to the place where it's kind of, you'd have to get the stepladder out to rip it down. So it was sort of an adaptation to it. And I appreciate the creativity and the adaptation. And also it was kind of, it just seemed awful to me that people had to do that. And to have that right outside a Jewish school where people are rattled for very understandable reasons. People are spooked and freaked out. They put on the chain link fence outside the school, there's a little playground there right on the corner. They put some of that plastic green, you can't see through stuff on the chain link fencing right after October 7th. They already had a full-time bodyguard standing outside them. They probably have a couple of them. So there's something about all of that was really unsettling. And I don't know why, but of all the different domestic responses to this politically, which have been very upsetting, something about seeing somebody tear down a kidnapped little flyer of a baby in many cases, and also to see some of the videotape, either they're expressing glee or just this vapid a response to what are you doing, is genuinely distressing, because I really don't get it. I cannot get into the mindset of someone who is tearing down a flyer of someone who's kidnapped, and this just sort of publicizing and expressing empathy with those who've been kidnapped in a horrible war zone.
But what does it say that Americans can't so much as tolerate a flyer of a missing person?
I think that the story is that Americans can, but a couple of people can't. The one thing that gets lost in a lot of the conversation about the reaction to this, I see a lot of conversation about anti-Semitism right now, and that is understandable because we're seeing some on the margins or within some of the pro-Palestinian rallies. You will see some explicit anti-Semitism, and it is legitimately upsetting at a time when there's been all of this. October 7th was just such a horrifying scale of violence, just so many Manson murders stacked up on top of each other. It's just unspeakable. I get that, but what we tend to forget is that Jews in America are the single most favorably looked upon religious group, and it's not close. It's plus 28 percentage points favorability versus unfavorability, and that's better than Catholics. It's better than every evangelical. Certainly better than Mormons and Muslims, sad to say, and atheists. But it is Americans have always had a really positive view of Israel, a really positive view of Jews. I think that the default is not anti-Semitism, and it's not I'm going to rip down a flyer, and it's not even opposition to settlements. And I'm not a fan of settlements either in the West Bank. I think they're wrong. I think it's just that when you have a very vocal minority right now that people are just all ready to pay attention to and kind of be outraged by. So, I mean, you've probably seen the viral video of the new guy, Italian guy, confronting one of the dudes tearing down posters. And there's a reason why that went viral. It really spoke to a lot of both, I think, the general kind of New Yorker vibe, which is the really gruff tolerance. Like, you can go in the street and wave your Palestinian flag. I don't care, but don't tear down my poster. That has there's an intrinsic American sense of free speech that's encapsulated there, which doesn't exist in the same way in Europe, for example. It's upsetting, but it's a minority action.
Yeah, that's what I was going to just follow up on. Is this an instance of just extremist voices are getting played louder than the average American?
There's such a gap between what those voices are saying and what the average American, to the extent that that creature exists, thinks. Every single huge, usually tragic, but like just huge event is like a margin call. I see it like on Wall Street, right? Like there's a catastrophe happens. Did you leverage all of your buying? Like, do you have to suddenly like call in your loans right now? Well, it's sort of like that. 9/11 was like that. October 7th is like that too. Like suddenly you notice in a way that you didn't before what people have been saying on college campuses for the last 20 years and what like the faculty at Columbia are saying. And they've signed some really idiotic, in my view, group letters, talking about the October 7th action in the context of rights to resistance. And it's just like, no. And so people are noticing that there has quietly diverged, I think, this sort of set of opinions, especially on college campuses or in kind of left activist spaces right now, is what people are focusing on. And also within the media, probably, where there's a divergence of opinion about Israel and about some of these issues as well. And a lot of language that is associated with it too. Like I haven't seen the word decolonization used as much in the last week than I have the rest of my life combined, but people are just suddenly looking around and noticing, and just that huge gap. Because again, Americans' response to October 7th was like, yes, Israel, you have a right to respond. I mean, very positively towards Israel, defending itself and sort of creating its own zone of defense. We'll see how that plays out once the ground offensive gets going further and more innocent civilians die in Gaza, which is going to be terrible. But the general default is that. So it's the gap between that and then what's happening at Columbia University.
Yeah, there's definitely a gap. And I mean, what do you think of what's happening on college campuses? And we've heard, like you said, there's been so much more attention paid to it now, the White House talking about it. What do you think of it, and where do you see this trend moving?
I don't know. I've tried really hard my whole life, at least after I was kicked out of college for bad grades, to not pay a lot of attention to what happens on college campuses. In fact, I was of the opinion, my magazine that I work for, Reason, has done with our correspondent, Robbie Swaby. He's written a book or two about this concept of, has focused so much on collegiate kind of cancel culture and other things. When they first started talking about it a lot, I was sort of like, isn't it college kids being college kids here? Like, are we just like hippie punching here and like seeking to be outraged by pretty normal youthful activity? My mind changed on that about 4 or 5 years ago with a documentary, actually, that my Fifth Column podcast colleague Michael Moynihan did for Vice News about Evergreen College, where there's a bunch of madness going on. And you sort of see the way that people were talking. And then also talking to Greg Lukianoff, who has a new book out called Canceling the American Mind that he wrote with Ricky Schlott. And he's worked for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, it used to be called now, and in Expression, FIRE, for a long time. And he has pointed out that there's just been this absolute explosion on college campuses, basically since 2014, of sort of cancellation events, people, faculty getting fired. Sometimes they're getting fired because of pro-Palestinian sentiment, by the way. That is a large category of the crackdown. But there's just been a lot more yen for that kind of censoriousness. And what those people predicted then, and which I undersold then and now have come to believe, is that turns out college people graduate and go into the world. And they went into the world, and they went into a lot of media companies, and they went into a lot of places where the sort of cultural white collar means of discussion, is an inelegant way of putting it, and had impact there. And so this sense of censoriousness has been spreading sadly throughout the culture. And I hasten to add that sounds like I'm making a very left-directed critique here, There has also arisen a very right of center, I think, personified by Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, of like, we're going to crack down on that by using the same large stick. We're going to be censorious on our own towards these people. We're going to fire, this DEI administrator or whatever. And I think you can see on Capitol Hill, both major parties are trying really hard to rewrite the 1996 Communications Decency Act to narrow the scope of free expression. I think that's bad. We are in a illiberal moment of free speech in America, through the public, through the major parties, and I worry because the bulwark against that, for the most part, right now, is a Supreme Court that has been historically strong on free speech the last 10 to 15 years. The question is, can you maintain a persistent divide between American public opinion and Supreme Court decisions? There's an argument that they don't like to get that far away from it. So I'm trying to argue, and allies, to use a bad word, are trying to argue that we need to bolster the culture of free speech so that the instinct is not to tear down a poster or tell a pro-Palestinian activist that he or she cannot protest in the street, which is a lot of people are doing in Europe right now. It's neither of those things. It's like, go out, do your best, do your worst, allow people to talk and debate and disagree with one another vociferously. That's what we do here in this country. But don't try to stifle speech before it starts.